Now we're going to move on to creating this dropdown that appears when we click on the text field. The dropdown consists of the search result list with the styles for hover and click, and the trending today section that consists of a list of posts, also with styles for the hover and click states and these line separators. The dropdown is scrollable, it has rounded corners, and casts a nice shadow. This dropdown is a complex, beautiful, and interesting component to create. It'll help us to see in practice how to use different kinds of CSS positioning. We'll use Flexbox a lot here, and a lot of other cool stuff. So, how would I approach creating an element as complex as this dropdown? Well, in the same way we approached creating this whole web page. Let's break the dropdown into pieces that are small enough for us to easily create. Let's think about the first piece that we can create. We need an HTML element that will contain all the smaller elements. And a div would be a perfect container element here because it allows us to put block and text elements inside of it. So let's add that div. We'll open the index.html file and we'll place it inside the search div after the search input. And I'll explain why it's a good idea to put it here in a moment. It'll certainly need a class that will target from our CSS code. This div will be for the search results dropdown. So I think the name search results is descriptive enough here. And as for the content, let's just simply write here search results to start from somewhere. And if I reload our page, there it is. Notice that by default, it's inside the search div and it's at the end because it's one of its Flex children. But we don't want that. What we want is to take it from the normal document flow and place it under the search bar over the other content on the page. Earlier in this course, you learned that we can do this by using the absolute and other types of CSS positioning. So let's copy this class name and add a rule for the search results and set the position property to absolute. Now notice that the search results div is no longer a Flex child. It has been moved here and now overlaps the content of the search bar. And to make the search results div easier to see, let's make its background color green. Okay, now we can clearly see its boundaries and that it's hiding the zoom icon and a part of the search field. We'll fix that later, and now let's see how we can position it properly. Remember that when we use the absolute position, we unlock special properties for that element, which are top, right, bottom, and left. They will allow us to move the element around the screen. So let's set the top property to 0 and the left property to 0, 2, and see what happens. And okay. That moved the div to the top left corner of the page. That's a start, but ideally what we want is that the top and left properties to work relative to the top left corner of the search bar. So that if we decide to move the search bar somewhere else, or if we decide to adopt our page to support mobile, then it's going to be really easy to do. So to make the top and left properties be relative to our search bar, which is this HTML element, and it's a parent of the search results div, we can also use the position property and set the position of the search bar to relative. So for that, I'm going to add position relative here. Now, if I reload the page, notice that the search results div now is absolutely positioned relative to the search div. This is because remember that when we apply position relative to an element, as we are doing here for the search, then if it has a child element with the absolute position, which is this search results div, then the top, left, right, and bottom properties of this absolutely positioned child are now calculated from the top, left, right, and bottom of the relative positioned parent. To put it simply, notice that when the search div has a position relative, the search results is at its top left corner. But if I turn off the relative position, then the search results is moved to the top left corner of the page. So setting the relative position to the search is what we want to easily position the search results. Next, let's make it as wide as the search div. What the relative position also allows is to set the width of its absolutely positioned child, so the width, to 100% like this. And this makes the search results div be as wide as its relatively positioned parent, which is the search div. And this is exactly what we want. Now let me show you what happens if I turn off the relative position here. Without it, the search results div is as wide as the page, because it's now absolutely positioned relative to the page itself and has its width property set to 100%. There are times when you want a behavior like this, for example, when you're creating a modal window, but in our case, we want the search results to be as wide as the search bar. And for that, we need its position to be relative. Next, to make the drop-down content start right below the search, we're going to use padding. And we will set the top padding of the search results div to be equal to the height of the search div. If this sounds confusing, don't worry, you'll see what I mean after we do this. So let's calculate the search height, which is its vertical padding, so 10 plus 10, 20. And also we'll add its content height, which is this, but we'll round it up, or technically seal, to 19 pixels, which means that the total current search height is 39 pixels. And we'll use this value to set the top padding of the search results to 39 pixels. So for that, I'm going to write padding top 39 pixels. Pixels. And reload the page. Great. Now the content of the search results container starts right after the search. But the problem is that the dropdown covers the search, and we don't want that. To fix this, we need to put the dropdown or the search results behind the search somehow. And because the dropdown is absolutely positioned, we can use the z-index property. And one side note, when I say the dropdown, I actually mean search results div. So I'm going to use the dropdown or the search results div interchangeably. And back to the z-index. If you have a hard time remembering these positioning related properties, go back to the CSS positioning section of this course and watch it to refresh your knowledge, because it's certainly useful to come back and review that material from time to time. Okay, by default, all positioned elements have their z-index set to 0, which means that if the search z-index is 0 and we want to put the search results behind it, then we can set its z-index to a smaller number, which will be -1. So z-index -1. And if I reload the page, there you go. Now the search is on top and we can use it, and the dropdown is behind. Also, notice that the drop-down content starts right below the search. This is because we set its top padding to the same value as the height of the search. And that created several issues here. First, the drop-down corners are not the same as the search corners. And we don't want them to be like this. So to fix this, we can go to VS Code and just copy the border radius from the search and put it here. And when I reload the page, okay, this is better. And this is a padding issue. We'll fix it later. And so another issue here is that the dropdown is now not only behind the search, but it's also behind all the page content. I can tell this because its background color is green, but we can still see this gray border here. To better demonstrate this, I'll quickly set the background color of the sidebar div to red. So for that, I'm gonna, okay, this is a sidebar, and I'll add a new rule, background color red, reload the page. Notice that this sidebar covers the dropdown, but we want the opposite. We want the dropdown to be in front of it. So to fix this, we'll use positioning again. We'll change the position property of the header element, which is a parent of the search, and search results. So we'll set the position property of the header to relative. This will allow us to use the z-index property to lift the header up, which will also lift up its positioned children, one of which is this search results div. So let's find the header rule. Oh, it's here, and we'll add position relative here. And this alone will not fix the issue because the header has a default z-index of 0. But if we set its z-index to any integer, that is greater than 0, say 1, and this will fix the issue. And move the header and its children, along with the search results, to the front. Now the dropdown is above the rest of the content, so it's above this sidebar and it's above this border, but it's behind the search. And now we can remove this red and green backgrounds. So I'm going to remove this one, and let's also remove this CSS rule. Great. But notice that now that we removed the green background, we can see the green line here. This is because by default, the background is transparent. But we don't want that. We want it to be white. And for that, we actually want the background color property here, but instead of green, we want it to be white. And when I reload the page, notice that the border is no longer visible where the dropdown is. Next, let's add the shadow, this shadow, to the dropdown so that we can easily see its boundaries. For that, we're going to go to the reference page and inspect the dropdown. Now, the problem is that as soon as I inspected the dropdown, the input lost its focus, and so the dropdown disappeared. So for now, as a temporary solution to this issue, let's just select this search results div here, because I know that we need to select this one, and I'll show you a better way a little bit later. Okay, usually it's not practical to type in shadows manually because they contain custom colors and it's easy to make a mistake. So under the Styles tab, let's collapse the emulation. We're interested in this box shadow property, and let's just copy the whole value here, and then go to our code and add box shadow and paste the value. This is what I was talking about. This value is too complex and not practical to type in manually because it's really easy to make a mistake here. And let me quickly format the value to make it more readable. Okay, this means that we're going to add two shadows here that are separated by a comma. And in the first shadow, this first value, this 0, means where the shadow is horizontally. And 0 means that it's just right behind an element. The second value moves the shadow vertically. 1 pixel means that the shadow will be placed 1 pixel down. Next, the third value configures how blurry the shadow will be. So it's going to be 4 pixels blurry. And the fourth value here determines how big or small the shadow is relative to the size of its element. 0 means that the shadow is the same size as the search results div. And the last value is the color of the shadow. Here we're using the RGBA color format, which allows us to set the color and its transparency as the fourth value. So this color is black, but very transparent. And then the second shadow here is kind of the same, except it's 4 pixels lower. And now, if I reload the page, the drop-down has this nice shadow and looks much better. Great. I think we have finished creating the drop-down container, and we can pick a next part to work on. Let's see. We're going to need a scrollable element to hold all these search results and trending items. We can also add this line to the element using the border property. So let's create the scrollable container. For that, I'm going to add another div here. Let's also add a class. We'll call it search results scrollable. And we'll need a closing div tag. And also let's write search results in here. And if I reload the page, visually nothing has changed because divs are just container elements. But now we can style the new div. So I think let's add this line to the div. And for that, I'm going to copy this class name and add another CSS rule inside our style sheet. We can add the line in many different ways, but the easiest is to use the border property. The line will be above the content of the div, so we'll set the top border. And as for the border value, we'll copy it from this reference page because just as with shadows, it's important to understand a border value, but there is no practical advantage to typing it in manually. So I'm going to inspect this to get the value. There it is. I will copy this border top value from here. And then here we'll write border top and paste the value. And this should look like this. There is our border, and next let's move it down to match the header line. We'll do this by increasing the top padding value of the search results to push the content down along with the top border here. And what we can do is we can first find out the value we need in the developer tools. Then we'll update the style sheet. So for that, let's select the search results and open the styles tab. Then we'll click here and increase the top padding. And 47 is good enough. Once again, keep in mind that when we change the styles in the DevTools, it only has a temporary effect. When we reload the page, all the changes are reverted. So when you use the DevTools, don't forget to move your changes to actual style sheets. And this is what I'm going to do now. We need to set this padding top to 47 pixels. There you go. And now we can start building the recent searches component. The recent searches component is just a list of items where each item consists of an image, some text, and then a button. And when we hover over an item or click on it, it is highlighted. And also notice that the same thing happens with the remove button. To create this recent searches component, we'll use the split into smaller pieces approach again. We will need a container element like a div for the entire component, and then we will put a bunch of smaller elements inside. Most of the time, when you have a component with multiple similar elements, like here, it's better to use a list element. And usually it's an unordered list. So let's add a list. For that, in the index.html file, I'm going to remove this text and add a UL element. Remember that UL is short for an unordered list. Let's add a class right away. We'll call it recent searches. Remember that UL is a block element by default, and it's a container where we put list items. So let's add our first list item, and for that we'll use an li element. Usually it's a little bit better to also assign a class to these list items and target them by their class name from CSS. But I think you already learned how to do that really well, so for the sake of practice, we'll use different CSS selectors here. And because of that, we're not going to assign any classes to this list item. And next, let's also add markup for this image, this text, and this button. We'll start by adding an image here, and we'll add the src attribute and leave it empty for now. Then let's create the community folder under the images, community. We created this folder just to organize our images, and let's save this little image inside our new community folder. Make sure that you save that image inside the community folder too. And then let's point to this image using a relative path, which will be images, community, and community icon 1.png. And let's also add the community image class to this image. And if I reload the page, okay, this is nice. Next, we'll add a div element for the actual recent search. And for that, I'm going to copy this text, and in our HTML file, I'll add a div with a class about recent search value, and we'll paste the text. And okay, there is the text. And for this, we'll need to add a button element. So let's add a button here. And also a class. It's going to be recent search remove. And to have this icon as our button, we're going to need to add an image, and an image inside this button. Now for the image, we'll create a new folder under images, and the folder will be icons. And this is where we'll save this remove icon. Notice that the actual icon name is close.svg. Okay, we created these subfolders because we're going to have a lot of icons and community images. And this way, it's going to be easier to work with them. Then we'll point to this close icon from our HTML code. So images, icons, close.svg. And if I reload the page, amazing. Now we've got all the HTML elements we need, and we can start styling these, because this isn't that pretty. First, let's remove this black bullet from our list items. The browser adds these bullets by default, but we don't want to have it like this. So to remove this bullet, we need to style the list container, which is this UL element. And for that, we'll copy its class name, and inside the search.css file, we'll add another CSS rule. Probably you remember that the property we need to hide those bullets is called list style. And to remove the bullets, we'll set it to none. And great, that removed the default bullets from our list items. Next, notice that by default, the elements inside the search item go from top to bottom. Or we could say that this is a vertical layout. Okay, so what can we do to make them go from left to right? Nowadays, most of the time, the answer is Flexbox. So let's use Flexbox. Now we want this image and this div and this button to be on the same line, which means we have to make their parent, which is this list item, a flex container. Notice that this list item doesn't have a class, so we can't just target it by its class name from our CSS code. What other options do we have? We could use a tag selector like this. But the problem is that this will target all li elements from all other lists on the page. So we need to narrow down this selector And what we could do is limit it to the list items only inside the recent searches. And we can use the child combinator for that. To use the child combinator, I'm going to update this and target the recent searches class first. Then I'll type space greater than space, where these spaces are optional and we use them here to improve the code readability. But this greater than symbol is not optional. You probably remember from previous tutorials in this course what this selector means. It means target only the li elements that are direct children of the recent searches class. And now let's add here display flex to turn each of these list items into a flex container. And when I reload the page, okay, now the elements are positioned from left to right because they are now flex children and the flex direction is row by default, which places them horizontally. Also because the align items is set to stretch by default, the button and text are stretched vertically to match the height of the tallest flex child, which is this image. And we can enable flex debug here for this list item to see this better. These dashed lines show the boundaries of each of these flex children. Now let's change this and set the align items property to center, which will return them to their natural size and center them vertically. Next, let's style the flex children one by one, starting with this image. And based on what we see here, we'll need to make the image much smaller. Let's inspect the image to see the actual values that we need to use. Okay, its width and height is 16 pixels. We'll use that. Now to target the image, we can use its class name. So let's copy the class name here, and then we'll write period, and then paste the class name. And then we'll write width 16 pixels and height 16 pixels. When I reload the page, this is better. Okay, let's turn off the flex debug and adjust the spacing on the left side of the community image compared with this. Notice that we've got more space here than we need. First of all, let's investigate where this space is coming from because we didn't set it explicitly. Normally, the fastest way to find out is to hover over the space and then inspect. I inspect it with the mouse, but usually I use a keyboard shortcut. It's much faster and more convenient, so I recommend you to learn the shortcut. To learn the shortcut, you can hover over this little inspect button here in the DevTools, and after a few seconds, you'll see a tooltip with the shortcut. It's Command-Shift-C for Mac and Control-Shift-C for Windows. Okay, so let's try the shortcut to inspect this space and then click on the space. And it is selected the list of the recent searches. And when I hover the mouse over the list in DOM tree, notice the green rectangle on the left, which is padding. And in the box model here, you can see that this is a 40 pixel padding here. So this is where the space on the left side is coming from. Now let's remove this padding from the list because we will add it to individual list items. And we've already got a rule that targets the list here. So let's use this rule and set its padding to 0. In our case, it's not important to specifically target only the left padding, so we can use this shorthand property that targets all the sides, because it's less typing and makes our code a bit simpler. Okay, and when I reload the page, this is good. But notice that there is also this extra space at the top and bottom of the list. And if we look at the box model again, we can see that there is a default 16 pixel margin at the top and bottom of the list. Let's remove this margin as well. For that, we can also use the margin shorthand property, and we'll set it to 0 from all sides. And we're using the shorthand property for the same reason as we used it for padding, because the left and right margins were 0 anyway, and we wanted to remove the top and bottom margins. And this way our code is a little simpler. Great. Now that we've removed the default space, we can configure it to our liking. So to add the space around the search item, we'll use padding. And the reason for that is that notice that on the reference page, every search item has this space around it. And when I hover over a search item or click it, it receives this gray background, and the empty space receives the background too. And remember that when we assign a background to an element, its padding will receive this background, but its margin will not. And because we want this space to receive this gray background, we will use the padding property. Now let's inspect this list item to find out what padding values we're going to use. And to inspect this item, I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut, so Command-Shift-C for Mac or Control-Shift-C for Windows. Then I'm going to hover over the free space and click on it. Okay, so the values for our padding will be 4 pixels for the top and bottom and 24 pixels for the left and right. Now we already have this CSS rule that targets all list items in recent searches. So let's extend this rule and add padding. And we want 4 pixels for the top and bottom and 24 pixels for the left and right. And when I reload our page, this is better. And next, notice that when I hover over a list item in the recent searches, here it changes the color and the cursor becomes a pointer. Let's add this behavior to our items as well. And this is easy. We need to add a CSS rule that targets the list items in their hover state and then set the background color property and the cursor to pointer. And then to get the background color, we can use the DevTools and inspect the search item, then set its emulated state to hover, and then copy its background color here. And we've done this enough times, so I'm going to ask you to pause this video and do it yourself first. Then we'll do this together so that you can check your solution. Okay, so I'm going to copy the color from here and then go to VS Code and add a new CSS rule that will target recent searches, then the direct child combinator and li to target list items inside the recent searches. And here we'll set the background color property, and I'll paste the color we copied earlier. We also want to change the cursor to pointer on hover, and this rule actually targets the normal state of list items. So let's add :hover to target the hover state. And now when I reload the page, there you go. When we hover over list item, it gets highlighted. Great. Next, I'm going to ask you to style the active state of this list item. So when we click it, like here, it should change its background color as well. So pause the video and add another CSS rule that targets the active state of search items. Use the DevTools to emulate its active state and get the background color you need. And also don't worry about the search corners getting like this on hover. We'll fix that after you finish handling the active state. Okay, well done. And see you in the next video that will start by coding this together. And I'm going to add the link here when it's ready.